In 1983, Arthur Hutchinson became Britain's most wanted man for killing 3 members of the same family on what was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives.
A wanted poster shows the face of the man police describe as extremely dangerous.
Murders, particularly on a wedding day, such as it was, are exceptionally unusual. I don't know of another case in the United Kingdom that matches that sort of horrendous outcome as this case did.
I've seen many terrible things in my time as a journalist. I've seen mass death, but I've never seen anything like this, and I never, ever would want to see anything like that again.
Hutchinson had been on the run, having faced charges for rape and burglary.
It was from Selby Magistrates Court a month ago that Arthur Hutchinson escaped from police custody. He got out through a toilet window.
Just that one little event, a window being open at a toilet, I wouldn't say it changed the course of history, but it did for several families.
Dino is Arthur Hutchinson's nephew. His whole family were considered targets for his serial killer uncle.
It was my father that told me that it was Arthur that committed the murders, and it was very shortly after that that the police decided that we had 24/7 police armed protection. We had 2 police in our house with a gun.
Hutchinson has a very violent background. He's obviously a very dangerous man at the present time, and he may well still be armed with a weapon.
I knew that he was a petty criminal and a burglar and get into fights, but if somebody had said, yeah, and he's going to go on to kill 3 people, I'm going to be one of the most infamous murderers in Britain, I wouldn't have believed them.
Arthur Hutchinson became the serial killer known as the Fox. But to his nephew Dino, he was just one of his many uncles and aunts.
Arthur wasn't the typical uncle. He wasn't a typical person that he would sort of take a younger child to heart and play with and have fun with. He was just sort of... He did have family loyalties, but he was just a bit of a cold person. My dad was Arthur's elder brother, and I think he did feel a sense of responsibility for him. And I think he always wanted to help him all the way through his life. Even though he never went to see him in prison, I still think my dad felt a sense of duty or loyalty to him as a family member, and a sense of duty to his mother.
Arthur and Dino Sr. were part of a blended family. They grew up in a tough neighbourhood in the north of England with his half-brothers and sisters.
Being an illegitimate child in those days was actually something that carried a huge amount of stigma, but to entertain that stigma in your own home takes that to a new level.
Arthur Hutchinson was from an area of Hartlepool called Oughton Manor. It was a very, very tough, rough area. As a youngster, he was frankly a bad egg. There's no other way to describe him. He attacked one of his siblings with a pair of scissors when he was very young.
When he was 7, he'd stabbed one of his sisters, and some of the other half-brothers and sisters, they sort of did totally disown him and almost pretend he didn't exist, which you can understand.
When you hear about children using weapons to harm siblings, you automatically understand that you are dealing with something that is far more sinister than would be expected for that age frame. Now, this indicates, firstly, a willingness to cross boundaries, a willingness to engage using a weapon to cause harm. That demonstrates callous nature. And when we have a callous nature in a child, it leads us to have suspicions about their long-term potential.
It was a big family, brought up in a mining village, probably a hard life back in them days, and what I gather he was regarded as a little local hard man, got into fights a lot, a bit of a life of petty crime when he was younger, things like that.
One of the problems that occurs when families entertain such dysfunction, it can do one of two things. It can either bring the family together because they connect over a common belief system, i.e. this human being is heinous and we must reject them, or what we find is split and divided loyalties. Now that breaks families down. So whilst they deal with the trauma, it won't necessarily have dissipated the relationships around them.
As they grew up, Arthur and his elder brother Dino grew closer, with Dino often supporting Arthur.
Arthur and my dad did have some good times together, you know, even if it is just in the gym, lifting weights. They'd come round to the house and they'd sort of talk about the childhood. You know, they'd have a typical older brother, younger brother relationship in later life.
Dino was somebody who had quite an interesting relationship. It was one of bravado, it was one where they would weight train together, they were competitive, but also there was almost this sense that he would have wanted to show his half-brother that actually he was the bigger man.
Arthur did actually move down to Skipton in the 1970s, I think, in a sort of attempt to rehabilitate. He was working at the local foundry. He was living in my father's house, or one of my father's house, rent-free, but it turned out that he was actually claiming benefits and telling the benefit people that he was paying rent, which upset my father and caused a bit of a dispute between them. So my father turfed him out of the house, which obviously angered Arthur.
That evening would prove to be a turning point in both Arthur and his family's lives.
This is probably the first time I've really been back and contemplated the seriousness of what happened on that night. My father worked night shift. He was going on his motorbike to work, as he always did, set off about 7:30, and Arthur had a disagreement with him. My dad would have been coming on the left-hand side of the road there, so anywhere on here, I presume. Back in them days, there was no traffic about hardly. After 6:30 of an evening, it was the late 70s, not many people had cars in them days. And they were probably, I would expect he'd probably been hiding over there. And then got himself a gun and waited for the opportune moment.
He then waits for him on a bridge before work, uses a gun to try to shoot his half-brother dead. Now he misses, but the point is, he casually after this drives to work. That says something about his nature. Firstly, that he's willing to harm somebody that he should love. Secondly, who has provided accommodation for him. He doesn't play by the rules. He has been scorned, and you shall pay, is the way that he justifies his case.
My dad just told me that Arthur had tried to shoot him, but been unsuccessful. We weren't really sure whether it was true, because my dad did like to tell stories, but it turned out it was. But even then, he underplayed it, and he tried to sort of protect us and hide us from what had happened.
Arthur received a 5-year jail term for carrying firearms and the attempted murder of his half-brother. But despite this, Arthur's mother remained loyal to him.
She had lots of children. Arthur was the youngest boy, and he was the one that was closest to her, and maybe she felt very protective of him. And sometimes you do perhaps believe your children over evidence that's staring you in the face. And maybe Arthur was quite a convincing liar, and sometimes you like to see the good in your children rather than the evil. She'd sort of stuck by him through thick and thin. Even incidents where, like, he tried to kill his sibling, she sort of still could forgive him, and Arthur was the one child that she could rely on for love and feedback, and maybe they both sort of fed on that together.
In spite of his lifestyle, in spite of his choices, it seems that his mother could only ever see the good in him. And that is an unusual quality, because to some degree, when somebody can be so irresponsible, so cruel, so criminal, it's up to the caregivers to create consequences. If our caregiver rejects us because of our actions, then we understand that those actions must be dire. If they don't reject us, it gives us a very strange message about what is acceptable, and to some degree incites a narcissistic belief system about who you are.
Once he was released from prison, Arthur's life of petty crime would soon evolve into much more serious offences.
I don't know what was in Hutchinson's mind at the time when he was committing these murders. He was an irrational man. He just was careless as a criminal. He wasn't a very good criminal. He terrorised people, and he killed the family. And that's the reality of Arthur Hutchinson and how dangerous a man he is.
I would never have thought that he was capable of this, but then it just shows you maybe who's capable of what. But if somebody had said, yeah, and he's going to go on to kill 3 people and going to be one of the most infamous murderers in Britain, I wouldn't have believed them.
In his youth, Arthur Hutchinson had a reputation for being a hard man and a petty criminal, but his older brother, Dino Sr., had formed a bond that would last despite his crimes.
My father did love him, or he wouldn't have given him so many chances. You know, and I think even after he'd tried to shoot him, there was still... He never got angry about him. He'd never sort of instill in you that he was evil. I think he did try and protect us as children from the things that he was like. To us, he was just this distant uncle, Arthur, who was still a little bit of a black sheep, but, you know, my dad was sort of never saying, oh, he's done this bad, he's done that bad. He just he didn't try and taint our view of him. He sort of just let his your uncle, you form your own view of him by what you see and what he does.
Relations between Arthur and his nephew, Dino Jr., were, however, always strained.
The Arthur that I met, most of the time he did seem like a normal person. You know, you'd sort of have a conversation with him, and no time would you have had any inkling that he was going to turn into a mass murderer. But having said that, there was always an undercurrent of viciousness and anger, and apparently he did have a threshold for anger, and when he lost his temper, he wouldn't want to be on the other end of it. And he was also very vindictive, held grudges.
In 1983, Arthur's criminal behaviour escalated again, and on the 28th of September, he arrived at Selby Police Station, charged with theft, burglary and rape.
He was actually held in the cell area, and out of the cell area was a spiral staircase that led up to the dock in the courtroom above. Having been allowed to use the toilet, he went up these stairs, found himself in the dock, came out of that, and the decorators were still decorating, and there was scaffolding all over the place, and he merely crashed through a leaded window, landing on some barbed wire that protected an exercise yard, and he sort of trampolined off that and over into a field at the back of the police station and the courtroom, and he made good his escape. It was quite a dramatic escape. The painters and decorators, I think, were taken very much by surprise to see somebody appear and dive through a window.
The fact he knows that he's going to be facing a custodial sentence, he's willing to firstly put himself at risk by escaping and throwing himself out of a second-floor window. But secondly, the consequences of that action will mean that he is going to serve an even sterner sentence. He doesn't think about consequences. He is impulsive, even if that impulsivity leads to his own downfall. And this does show that there is a lack of connection emotionally with conscience, which makes him dangerous, because if you don't have conscience, and if you don't have consequence, then there's very little holding you to the moral compass.
The family was struggling to deal with Arthur's crimes. Now he was on the run from the police. His violent tendencies escalated.
His crimes were mainly sexual, violent and sexual. If a woman or a girl didn't want to let him have his own way, he would just take it. And that's why he got into so much trouble.
He had a threshold of anger that was very low, and he probably thrived on the fact that his esteem was from being violent and looked up to as being a bit of a hard man and a thug. And it's turned out that that part of his personality has got him where he is. And his efforts to improve and redeem himself didn't work.
In late October 1983, Arthur had been on the run for over 3 weeks and found himself in the village of Dore, just outside Sheffield.
Dore is what used to be a small, old-fashioned village. A lot of building works taking place, and at the time, it was a small community.
On the 23rd of October 1983, Basil and Avril Leitner had just hosted their eldest daughter's wedding at their home. Their 28-year-old son Richard and 18-year-old daughter Nicola stayed overnight.
The Leitners had been celebrating the wedding and the aftermath of the wedding, reception, family meeting, family gathering in their house. The Leitners' house was a substantial, fairly new build in large grounds.
Hutchinson had been watching the wedding from a neighbouring field.
I would think that Hutchinson was probably in the vicinity of the house for some hours, having seen the marquee and heard the merriment, if you like, from the reception, and that may well have attracted him if he was in the area. And he would make his way there and probably lie low until to see just how things developed.
With everything that they had, their beautiful home, their fantastic family, their loving friends, that incredible celebration, of course, for somebody of very little, that could trigger feelings of intense jealousy and anger. Why was I not entitled to the same? This is why I'm allowed to take it, because these people shouldn't deserve it any more than me. So, of course, that could have spurred him on. But undoubtedly, the most important part would have been the sadistic knowledge that he was about to ruin something that should have been a beautiful celebration.
That night, Arthur broke into the Leitners' house through the patio doors.
He may well have looked to find food, because eventually, when he did get into the property, he ate cheese from the fridge and he drank champagne from a champagne bottle. So he was obviously looking to sustain himself primarily, and to steal what he could steal, and Nicola was another attraction. Mr. and Mrs. Leitner, the mother and father, who slept in a room downstairs, and there was then her brother, who was a barrister, who slept in a room upstairs. Next to Nicola's room was really a suite of rooms, and there was a noise, and Mr. Leitner went to investigate what this noise was, and was confronted on the staircase by Hutchinson coming down the stairs, and he was fatally stabbed. Mrs. Leitner went to see what her husband was doing, and she too was fatally stabbed in her room, and the brother was also disturbed by this, and he again was stabbed by Hutchinson at the side of the bed where he was sleeping.
When you stab somebody like that, you are looking into their eyes, you are seeing their pain, you are hearing their breathing, and you are seeing their agony. It's about enjoying your work, and he undoubtedly had rage within him, but also he enjoyed his capacity for harm.
He then went and raped their daughter, Nicola, who was 18 at the time. She was awakened by Hutchinson, who had a knife to her. He said if she didn't do what he wanted, he would kill her. He dragged her through this blood-stained, blood-spattered house, past the body of her father, the body of her brother, and raped her.
Nicola was then made to come down the stairs and then go out into the marquee. And in the marquee, he again raped her and spent the night with her. And she was trapped in the marquee, and she stayed there until the next morning, when she was found by the people who had erected the marquee, who'd come to remove it and found Nicola in this horrendous state, having been savagely raped.
He wanted to have time to rape his victim, and consequently he murdered the other family members so that they didn't interrupt him. They were seen as obstacles that need removing.
Hearing about the murder, reading it in the press, I was living with my dad at the time, but initially we didn't know it was Arthur, just like there's been some mass murders near Sheffield. It was only a few days afterwards that it came to light that it was my Uncle Arthur.
Arthur Hutchinson only became someone out of the ordinary when he went to the home of the Leitners and he killed 3 people. And I don't think anyone to this day knows why he had to kill Mr. and Mrs. Leitner and their son.
There is something about him really taking joy in his work. Remember that. For him, this is not something provoking horror. Murdering those people is not computing to him. It's just about his sexual need. Nicola is his object of satisfaction. And sustaining himself so he can enjoy and satisfy himself further is important, and that's why he drinks and eats.
I've no idea why Arthur Hutchinson would leave Nicola alive, other than the fact that he may well have believed that she would eventually come away with him and live with him. It was that was his sort of mentality, that he believed he was able to persuade people to follow him and to want to live with him. It was 24 hours later that we actually identified Arthur Hutchinson as being the perpetrator, because we were able to examine the champagne bottle in the kitchen. We were able to lift the fingerprint from that bottle and do a comparison with Hutchinson's known fingerprints and to prove that he was the actual person who had handled that champagne bottle. And of course he was on the run, having been charged with a serious offence in Selby.
Survivor Nicola Leitner also gave a very clear description of the man who'd raped her and killed her family.
The picture that Nicola drew, or had drawn by the artist from the Star newspaper, almost was like a mirror copy of a photograph that had been taken by the Selby police only a month before, having arrested Hutchinson for the allegation of rape. And it was almost like a carbon copy. It was quite amazing.
They had a triple killer on the loose somewhere in Yorkshire, and this was a terrifying thing. If you can imagine, you've been sitting quietly at home as the Leitners had. They'd had a wedding, they'd gone to bed, they'd had a wonderful day, and they're all dead, butchered. There's no other word for what he did. He butchered them.
Arthur was on the run again, and the police were quick to get in touch with his family.
When we found out what Arthur had done, it was a sense of shock. It was shock that someone that you sort of knew but worked close to had done something, or allegedly done something atrocious. When we got the police there with the guns, that sort of brought it a little bit more home, but I don't know, it's hard to describe. It wasn't anything that you were sort of feeling any sense. I never felt any sense of terror. Probably a little bit of sense of excitement that you had police there with guns in your house, and the limelight was sort of on your family. It was just, I don't know how to describe it.
His half-brother, Dino Reardon, who had been a target for Hutchinson at one stage, and who genuinely believed, and it was a belief the police agreed with, that Hutchinson would try to kill him at some stage. He'd already tried to kill Dino once, and it's my belief that had he come face to face with Dino again, he would definitely have tried to kill Dino.
My dad tried to not let on that he was in any fear or we were in any danger. He just sort of tried to make it a bit light-hearted, probably to protect us. I'm sure he would have been quite concerned about it, but, you know, he kept that sort of, not quite a stiff upper lip, but that sort of not showing any fear. My father had 24/7 protection when he was on the run. There was a chance that he might turn up on his doorstep and try and get the ultimate revenge for things that had gone wrong previously.
With a dangerous killer on the loose, the police launched a nationwide manhunt.
Arthur had sustained a knee injury while he was escaping from the courtroom on some barbed wire, and he left some of this on the sheets at the Leighton house, and the police let out that this wound could be quite gangrenous and dangerous, and it might ultimately lead to his death. This was in the hope that it might sort of motivate Arthur to give himself in and seek some treatment rather than die of gangrene.
Hutchinson taunted the police while he was at large, and he was at large for several weeks. During this time, there were families in Yorkshire who would not go out at night.
After several weeks on the run, he came to be known as the Fox, which I think he quite liked the idea of. He was some sort of cunning criminal that was outwitting the police.
Hutchinson, the Fox, could not resist letting the police and public know he was on the run. He even called the local newspaper.
Hello, this is Hutchinson. Hutchinson? Yeah, the one that those people were hunting for. Tell you what, I've never left the area from Selby, right? I've never left the area from Selby. I've been here all this time. This place called Warstop, I don't even know where it is. The only time I've seen was when I'm living rough, like the police have said, the new one's living rough, that's what I'm doing, living rough. Yeah. Stealing out people's back gardens, cabbages and things like that. That's how I'm living. I sleep by day and I travel at night. Are you still there? Yeah, I'm still here, yeah. So what that's been? You know who I am, don't you? Sorry, I can't understand. I'm charged with burglary. Yeah. Right, so now you know who I am, don't you? Yeah. I'm not a hoax. No, right. So I'm not going to give myself up.
Every day you were wondering, is this going to be the day when he's caught? Everyone was sure he would be caught.
Desperate to catch their man, police received help from an unlikely source, Arthur's mother, Louise.
His mother was genuinely a poorly lady. She had a heart condition and she had had hospital treatment, but we engaged with the mother. She was very, very supportive, and we were able to persuade her to allow us to announce that she was being moved to hospital because she'd taken the turn for the worst. Cleveland police did remove her from the house and to film that her getting into an ambulance, and that was a successful operation. We were actually deceiving Arthur Hutchinson into thinking that his mother was in a critical state when she wasn't.
To help the police, Louise got them to put out that she was a lot iller than she perhaps was, knowing that this would make Arthur want to come back and see her, just in case it was something very serious. So I think ultimately that just showed that she did want him caught. But I think she knew that the longer it was out there, you know, he might get shot by the police, or, you know, he could have been injured.
Louise made no pretension about the fact that she thought her son was a wonderful boy. Like any mother, she found it hard to admit that he was, frankly, a vile, evil, sadistic killer.
On the 5th of November 1983, Arthur Hutchinson was finally tracked down.
Arthur was found in a field not far from where his mother lived. Dog handlers pursued him across the field, and he was arrested in that field. And that really was a triumphant moment. We were very delighted with that.
I'm sure that my father must have had very mixed emotions. You know, it was his brother, and you know, you always want to not think the best of them, but you don't. It's hard to imagine that they could be capable of such atrocities.
The headline was "Lame Fox is caught in big chase. Fugitive limps to the final drama," and the story told how he tried to run away, how a police dog had gone after him and got him. And I can remember thinking, I wonder if the dog bit him. I hope it did.
Arthur Hutchinson didn't focus on what he was doing in terms of whether he was ever going to be caught. I think he was arrogant enough to believe that he would never be caught. And of course, that arrogance led to him leaving fingerprints, leaving his teeth mark in the cheese, and leaving his blood on the bed sheets that seeped through the bandage on his knee. I think he was arrogant in believing that his prowess would allow him to escape from the area and he would never be caught.
In 1984, killer Arthur Hutchinson was finally in custody again, and this time facing murder charges.
When Arthur was caught, I don't know, it wasn't like a joyous thing or anything. It was just probably a sense of relief that they'd got him at last, and life to some extent for us could go back to normal. Not 100% normal, but you could resume. You know, you wouldn't have the police there, you wouldn't have the sort of wondering where he was, when he was going to turn up.
It was quite a relief, really, because you don't want villains like that roaming around the country where people were vulnerable, and it was good to have him captured, and then the hard work starts of putting the paperwork together and getting the correct conviction.
In September 1984, Arthur went to Durham Crown Court, charged with rape and triple murder. His mother Louise was the only member of the family to attend.
Crimes he'd committed were just so barbaric, they just didn't want any association. And it would have perhaps looked like, if you were going there, that you had some sympathy for him. And none of the family that I had, except for Louise, had any sympathy for him, just anger at what he'd done and let down his family as well as the Leightoners.
Hutchinson refused to admit any offences. He didn't admit the crimes that he'd been arrested for. And when he arrived at court and was invited to plea, he pleaded not guilty, and it was quite a lengthy trial, really.
Arthur Hutchinson just sat in the dock at Durham Crown Court, expressionless, cold, unfeeling, no sign of remorse. And usually in a prisoner you would see some sign of remorse.
He pleaded not guilty at his trial and held out all sorts of fanciful defences that Nicola had agreed to meet him, and she'd met him in a pub in Sheffield, and they were all fanciful statements that weren't true.
Nicola Leitner gave evidence. She's the bravest lady I ever saw, and that was the view of everyone at that court, because while she was giving evidence, the police took the unique step of showing a video, a colour video of the scene in that house, after Hutchinson had attacked the family. It was an amazing, horrendous, moving, terrible thing to watch.
As details of what the prosecution called an orgy of violence emerged, Hutchinson's mother collapsed in the public gallery, repeating, "He's not a bad lad, he's my boy." The trial continues tomorrow.
Following his mother's collapse, Hutchinson began to misbehave in court, even involving journalists in the proceedings.
In court, Arthur Hutchinson pointed his finger and said, "He's the killer. Wasn't me. I didn't kill the Leightoners. Michael Barron from the Sunday Mirror was the murderer." It caused absolute astonishment in court. Hutchinson blamed Michael Barron for this because Michael Barron had gone and interviewed Louise.
If you think about being a showman, and if you think about wanting people to see the twists and turns of something you create, you can understand that for him, throwing that would have just caused confusion and questioning, but more importantly, his mother, who he wants to make believe that he is a good human being, might just buy into it. So that performance would very much be about showing his mother, "I love you, and I'm protecting you, and this is all a fix."
Everybody in the family did talk about him because of the infamy, but it's like, for some ways there was the infamy and he was your brother, but then there's also the things that he was always the black sheep of the family.
On the 14th of September 1984, Arthur Hutchinson was found guilty of the murders of Richard, Basil and Avril Leitner and the rape of Nicola.
He was sentenced to life imprisonment, but I think an 18-year minimum term. But ultimately, the law changed and it became possible for the Home Office and the Home Secretary to determine whether it was to be a whole life sentence. And eventually was pronounced that he would serve life means life and he would serve a whole life term. Hutchinson made all sorts of appeals to the Court of Human Rights and that sort of thing.
Arthur's appeals were supported by his brother Dino.
The fact that Dino, who he actually tried to murder, has actually campaigned for his release is striking, if not shocking, because he believed that there is a certain time that you should serve and after that you should be allowed to walk free. But again, what does that say about the understanding of the gravity of pain inflicted on the victims? 3 people died. A family had their security ripped to pieces and a woman was raped mercilessly. This man does not deserve to walk our streets because this man cannot be reformed, in my opinion.
My dad, to some extent, did support the appeals. I don't know, my dad probably had very mixed emotions about it and maybe thought that if you've served your time, you should maybe be released. I think most of his brothers and sisters were saying he's not worth it and they just wanted to leave things by and totally compartmentalise it and sort of not acknowledge that Arthur were part of the family.
Arthur Hutchinson has appealed this sentence several times, but following a final ruling by the European Court of Human Rights in 2015, he remains on a whole life tariff.
Arthur's crimes obviously had a massive impact on the family. My grandma Louise, it must have been absolutely heartbreaking. You know, there's this son that she'd loved so much. She'd had a very hard life. She tried to bring him up best she could, and all her other children had turned out fine, respectable people. But there's this last one that couldn't control his anger. I can only imagine if I had a child that turned out like that, it'd just break your heart completely. I think she tried to convince herself that he wasn't guilty because of his protestations, and maybe he did have a good side and she saw that good side.
Hutchinson was a real danger to the public. He didn't know the difference between right and wrong, and his mentality was such that he believed that everything was available to him and that nothing could stand in his way. And that type of individual is very, very dangerous. And Hutchinson did bring with him that very real danger. And I would guess, even at the age that he is today, that he still would be a danger to the public if he was released.
Despite not having seen his uncle since his imprisonment, Dino Jr. is still living with the impact of his uncle's horrendous crimes.
We're skiing, I think it was in Val d'Isère, and we're staying in a chalet. And we've been skiing with these people that said they were from Sheffield, but then as you got to know them after a couple of days, they mentioned they were from Dore, which didn't ring a bell initially, but then they says, oh, you might know our town. There was a family that was massacred a few years previous. And I'm like, oh my God, what do I say here? And my friends knew my situation, and they were a bit taken aback, and I think the people from Dore obviously recognised there was something going on, so I had to sort of own it and said, yeah, well, it was my half-uncle. And they went on to explain how massive a thing it was in their small community. For his own selfish needs, you know, to survival, he was willing to commit murder. And, you know, the families there are still living with that. And, you know, whatever I feel, it's absolutely inconsequential to how it's affected that family.
This sort of crime is very rare. I don't think there's been one quite like it in this country. I don't know of another case in the United Kingdom that matches that sort of horrendous outcome as this case did.
If I've told work colleagues that I've got a mass murderer, it's sort of almost a conversation stopper, but then people will sort of ask questions about it, probably end up looking it up on the internet, and then they'll say, oh God, yeah, do you remember that case? And the Fox, but nobody treats you any differently. You know, it's nothing that I was responsible for.
It's important to consider the offender's family, because it will have had a profound effect on them. Certainly the inquiry and their exposure to the media would have had an effect on them, but it's long-lasting. Hutchinson is still a family member, he's in prison, and the offences that he committed were horrid. They're bound to have effect on the family, so you really do concern yourself for the family's well-being as well.
I think that the problem is he's never admitted to the murders. I don't even know how you describe it, not even forgiveness. Perhaps now will be a good time for him to have a good think to himself and just tell the truth about the whole story. I think Arthur, to our family, is somebody that would half like to think had never existed and half like to forget, but we can't do. And he's just gone from being a petty criminal to being a murderer, and it's just a tragedy.